Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. In today's third episode of our summer series, you'll hear presentations from our conference, Menzies and the British Commonwealth of Nations. The first presentation will be from Dr. David Furse-Roberts on a 20th century Australian Whig, Robert Menzies and the 19th century British liberal tradition. The second presentation is from Dr. Charles Richardson, Menzies, Burkean liberal or Burkean conservative. The third presentation is by Alex McDermott on When Menzies Met Baldwin, Australian and English Conservatism, Difference and Convergence. The fourth and final presentation in this episode is from Dr. Kit Kowol on Australia in the post-war British conservative political imagination.
When Menzies took the word liberal for the name of his new party in 1944, he consciously assumed the mantle of the Victorian British Liberals to realise the same ideals of individual dignity, freedom and opportunity for Australians in the mid-20th century. Formed in 1959 from the remnants of the old Whig Party, together with free trade supporting Tories aligned with Robert Peel, the British Liberal Party of Gladstone inspired much of Australia's liberal movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Drawing on one of these conference themes of adapting British ideas to an Australian context, this paper discusses the extent to which the 19th century liberal tradition of Gladstone and others informed the liberal philosophy of Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister. While Menzies was heir to the more immediate Federation liberalism of Alfred Deakin here in Australia, his political creed had even deeper roots in the Whig-derived liberalism of Victorian Britain. Humane and reforming, yet deferential to the Crown and the Constitution, the Whig liberals of the Victorian era had a laudable track record of advancing human dignity and freedom. Campaigning for the abolition of slavery and child labour, they also agitated for the removal of civil disabilities against religious minorities, the extension of the franchise through these Reform Acts, the expansion of education and the rise of living standards for all. Surveying the British liberal movement of the Victorian era, this paper will explore the ways in which the ideas of leading British Whig and liberal figures including Thomas Babington Macaulay, John Stuart Mill and William Gladstone inspired Menzies' own liberal philosophy in Australia. In the Australian Prime Minister's own writings, Macaulay and Mill were quoted approvingly, whilst Gladstone was evidently admired as one of the great English liberals who helped inspire the mid-20th century revival of Australian liberalism. The first great Whig figure that informed Menzies' creed of liberalism was T.B., later Lord Macaulay, who was not only a celebrated historian but a Whig MP. Born in October 1800, Macaulay qualified as a barrister and became an MP for the pocket borough of Kowol. In his maiden speech to the House of Commons, he had called for the abolition of civil disabilities for the Jews in the UK. In conjunction with his parliamentary career, Macaulay penned his magnum opus, The History of England from the Accession of James II, releasing the first two volumes in 1848 and the third and the fourth in 1855. It was Macaulay's History of England that, of course, popularised the Whig view of history, a historical narrative that stressed the inevitability of socio-political progress. In Macaulay's understanding of history, it was the Whig development of liberal democracy, parliamentarianism, and constitutional monarchy that were the great driving forces of human progress. From a dim, benighted past to a bright, glorious present with the anticipation of an even better future. As a 20th century Australian liberal who revered the English Whig achievements of liberal democracy and constitutional monarchy, Menzies subscribed to this same view of history. In his radio address, The Achievements of Democracy, broadcast on 6th of November 1942, Menzies quoted Macaulay with approval as he chronicled the many accomplishments of democratic societies. After reciting a lengthy extract from Macaulay's History of England, where the Victorian historian had prophesied that the conditions of ordinary people in the 20th century would be superior to those of his own time, Menzies pronounced Macaulay's prophecies to be more than true. Surveying the past century since Macaulay penned his history, Menzies pointed to a catalogue of social advances, including increased life expectancy, superior health, hygiene and living standards, the abolition of child labour, the enfranchisement of women, higher education and religious toleration as proof that Macaulay's and indeed his own view of history had been vindicated. Just as Macaulay had attributed the progress in his own day to the English genius of liberal democracy, Menzies attributed these further advances to that same impulse. Menzies' evident admiration for Macaulay no doubt reinforced his own liberal dedication to parliamentarianism, constitutional monarchy, humane social reform, and vision for the common good. In mid-19th century Britain, the Whigs morphed into the Liberals, and we now turn to two leading English Liberals who influenced Menzies, John Stuart Mill and William Ewart Gladstone. Like Macaulay, J.S. Mill had been both an author and a parliamentarian. Born in London in 1886, Mill became a brilliant autodidact, mastering algebra, Latin, and the classics from an early age. From 1865 to 68, Mill served briefly as a member of Parliament for the city of Westminster, representing the new Liberal Party, founded by Lord John Russell in 1859. Like Macaulay, Mill supported liberal causes including the abolition of slavery and child labour, religious toleration, and the enfranchisement of women. Mill's most famous work was his 1859 treatise on liberty, where he propounded his liberal philosophy of individual freedom. In this essay, he celebrated the value of individuality, defended the rights of the individual against the tyranny of the majority, and affirmed that the personal morality of individuals was a private matter for neither the state nor the church to determine, providing no harm was done to others. Menzies himself described Mill's treatise as full of freshness and truth, and alluded to it approvingly in the formulation of his own liberal views. In his June 1942 address on freedom of speech and expression, he reiterated Mill's belief in protecting the individual conscience from the despotism of a majority. Defending free speech, Menzies quoted Mill to affirm that any individual claiming the freedom to express a point of view must also be prepared to concede to others the freedom to contradict that point of view. So in short, society must allow individuals to freely exchange, debate and test different ideas. In his 1947 Pleasant Sunday Afternoon address, Menzies again invoked Mill to declare that the essence of freedom is pursuing one's own good in their own way, so long as we don't deprive others of theirs. The other liberal principle of Mill that Menzies prized was that of respecting human individuality. In his treatise, Mill famously esteemed eccentrics and argued that attempts to conform individuals to uniform mould amounted to a despotism over the human mind and body. In his own philosophy of education, Menzies similarly affirmed the value of individuality. Echoing Mill's thoughts on education, Menzies told a school audience the good teacher is the one who sees his or her pupils as individuals, not to be forced into one mould, but encouraged to expand and grow. Yet for all the affinity that Menzies had with Mill's liberalism, there were some important differences as well. Influenced by the thought of Jeremy Bentham, Mill's liberalism was utilitarian, whereas Menzies was decidedly not. While both men prized individual freedom as key to human flourishing, the chief aim of life for Mill was the maximisation of human happiness and expediency, whereas for Menzies the most important thing was building the moral character of individuals and elevating the civilisational quality of society. While Mill had written a whole treatise extolling utilitarianism, education for Menzies was essentially about the pursuit of wisdom, truth and beauty. In a 1961 speech on the future of education, the main thing is that education must not be so resolutely utilitarian as to be pagan and degrading. This brings us to the metaphysical differences between the liberalism of Mill and Menzies. In common with the free thought of David Hume and Jeremy Bentham, The Victorian philosopher was an agnostic free thinker. As such, his liberal creed had a secular utilitarian orientation, affirming the primacy of individual autonomy and human happiness. Accordingly, he was inclined to view the Victorian Church and many of its teachings, particularly on gender, sexual ethics, and the Sabbath, as impediments to individual freedom. Menzies, on the other hand, though not a deeply pious man in habits, identified openly as a Presbyterian. Heavily immersed in the Bible from early childhood, Menzies' worldview and philosophy of liberalism had a firm and undeniable spiritual foundation. Peppered with quotes from Scripture, his speeches reflected a Judeo-Christian outlook, especially in his understanding of human beings, attitude to education, opposition to communism, and emphasis on moral character. Reflecting on the nature of democracy in October 1942, Menzies remarked that democracy is a spirit based on the Christian conception that in every human soul there is a spark of the divine, and that the souls of men stand equal in the sight of God. With this spiritual foundation, the liberalism of Menzies preached the importance of selfless individualism, exhorting citizens in civil society to be lifters rather than leaners, contributors rather than beneficiaries, and givers rather than receivers. As such, his liberalism went far beyond J.S. Mill's minimalist ethic of no harm to others, to appeal instead to the biblical ethic of preferring one another. Certainly, the spiritual quality of Menzies' liberalism had more in common with that of the British Prime Minister Gladstone, and it is to him we now turn to as the final British Liberal. Australia's Governor-General Sir Paul Hasluck once observed that Menzies saw himself as a political heir to Gladstone, and indeed Menzies' brother, Frank Gladstone Menzies, was named after the Liberal statesman. So Gladstone was born in Liverpool, Britain, in 1809. Initially aligned with Robert Peel's Tories, he joined the New Liberal Party in 1859 and went on to serve as Prime Minister 4 times, from 1868 to 74, 1880 to 85, briefly in 1886, and finally 1892 to 94. Like Macaulay and Mill, Gladstone was dedicated to maximising individual liberty and supported policies to loosen the political and economic restraints on citizens. As a lifelong Church of England man, shifting from evangelicalism to high church later in life, Gladstone's liberalism had a sustained spiritual foundation and moral compass, viewing freedom and liberty not simply as means to human happiness, but as moral ideals. His domestic and foreign policies were directed to that end. According to the British historian David Bebbington, Gladstone's faith entered his political speeches and influenced his policies, most notably on Irish Home Rule, the dignity of self-help, and limited role of government. Following the example of Gladstone, Menzies had a similarly moral and spiritual conception of freedom. He viewed the Western struggle against Cold War communism, for instance, as a contest between the Christian conception of the true freedom of the human mind and spirit and the dictated unfree human spirit that existed under communism. The other feature of Gladstonian liberalism evident in Menzies' own philosophy was its appeal to working people. In office, Gladstone calibrated his Liberal Party to appeal to the working class and lower middle class of Britain in his dedication to improve their living standards. To help enfranchise workers, Gladstone's Trade Union Act of 1871 made unions legal and protected their funding from lawsuits. In Australia in the 1940s, Menzies similarly appealed to working people in his Forgotten People speech. He appealed to workers including shopkeepers, salary earners and farmers, whom he credited as the backbone of the nation. In the 1949 election campaign, he campaigned with advertisements declaring his belief in trade unionism and in the rights secured by wage earners. Like Gladstone, he appreciated that socialism has no monopoly on working people and that it was eminently possible for a pro-worker liberalism to serve their best interests. The liberalism of Menzies, however, differed from that of Gladstone in one important respect. In the Victorian era of empire and trade, Gladstone had been a champion of free trade, essentially viewing it as a vehicle to furthering freedom, prosperity and world peace. Menzies, on the other hand, was a protectionist, and in that respect he was arguably closer to Benjamin Disraeli than Gladstone. And, Menzies remained loyal to the Deaconite orthodoxy of protecting Australian agriculture, industry and manufacturing. The Menzies protectionist policies were deemed necessary to sustaining Australia's manufacturing base, high standards of living, broad middle class and economic sovereignty. For all the chronological distance between the Victorian British Liberals, Menzies and our own time, there are golden threads of continuity in Liberal thought that can inform and nourish the Liberal Party of Australia today. Through the mediating role and example of Menzies, today's Liberals can adopt and indeed champion several of these principles exemplified by the great English Liberals. From the historian T.B. Macaulay, Australian Liberals can recover his hope in socio-political progress. Australian Liberals can dare to dream that our tomorrows will be brighter than our todays, and that this hope must inspire practical policies to lift the living standards and well-being of ordinary Australians. From the philosopher J.S. Mill, we must celebrate the individuality of all people and let 1,000 blossoms bloom, particularly in our education system, and recover the primacy of free speech. Australian Liberals must defend the free intercourse of ideas without the dead hand of censorship and cancel culture. Such liberty will not only make Australians freer, but more intellectually resilient and secure in their own beliefs. Finally, from the grand statesman W.E. Gladstone, Australian Liberals can champion a free enterprise liberalism that is also worker-friendly. Our workers are our nation's asset, and we need to stand up for the interests of workers by putting Australian industries and businesses first. When our workers thrive from plentiful and secure employment, our families are stronger and the social fabric of our nation is all the healthier. Above all, from Gladstone and Menzies, Australian Liberals need to appreciate that the Anglo-Australian tradition of liberalism has a firm Judeo-Christian foundation. Even in our highly secularised age, the spiritual strand of Australian liberalism is more important than ever to underwriting the dignity and freedom of every individual, so basic to our liberal creed. It reminds Australian Liberals that whatever our personal faculties, every human being is too intrinsically precious to be expended in the name of utility. With his acute sense of history and indebtedness to the greats of our past, Menzies was able to remarkably synthesise the thoughts of these English Liberals into a revived Australian liberalism fit for the mid-20th century. As Australian Liberals again consider a reset for 2025 and beyond, they too can be inspired by the best of our past to address the needs of the present and chart the future to a better tomorrow. Thank you very much.
It's only our first day, but we've already learnt, if we didn't know before, that Robert Menzies was steeped in the British political tradition. One of the exponents of that tradition that he particularly admired was the 18th century statesman Edmund Burke. And I think that's interesting because Burke, like Menzies, is a locus of debate as to whether he was fundamentally a liberal or a conservative. Both men seem at times to embrace strands of both traditions. Burke first achieved fame as what we would now call a political liberal, though the word wasn't used in that sense in his time, especially for his support of America in the War of Independence. But his later career, when he led the reaction against the French Revolution, became the inspiration for generations of conservatives. Although Menzies' philosophical pretensions, let's say, were more modest than Burke's, and therefore his apparent inconsistencies were somewhat less theatrical, there are important similarities between them. Briefly, my thesis is that both men were divided personalities, torn between liberal and conservative impulses, but that Menzies, by and large, succeeded in overcoming that division and producing a workable synthesis of the two traditions in a way that had eluded Burke. And I propose to compare them under four headings: politics, social philosophy, economics, and personality. So, Burke was never just a politician. He always had other concerns. To use a modern term, he was a public intellectual. He wrote books on philosophy, engaged in controversy on a variety of topics. Menzies did very little of that. Once he took up politics, he gave it his devoted attention. So it's obvious, and it's in no way disrespectful to point it out, that even when Menzies' words aren't political in inspiration, they are the words of a politician, and you can't really understand them without that context. It's easy to forget that the same is also true of Burke. He certainly had other interests, but he was hooked on politics, and you can't understand his philosophizing without understanding the political background. He was always a politician, and it's in the last years of his life, when he lost some of the political structure, that his thought lost some of its coherence. So, to look at something of the 18th century political context, 18th century Britain was not a democracy. Political power was held by a narrow class of landowners. Only a small proportion of the population had the vote. Much of the House of Commons consisted of relatives or dependents of aristocrats. Nonetheless, by the standards of the time, the system was relatively open and responsive. It was a constitutional state. While the king held significant power, he ruled through ministers who were responsible to Parliament. The precise boundaries of the powers of monarch and ministers and Parliament were uncertain and were subject to a good deal of debate. And as you might expect, a lot of that debate centred on the role of political parties. By Burke's time, the old Tory party had largely disappeared. Politics was a contest between different factions of Whigs. Burke was patronised by the leader of one of those factions, the Marquess of Rockingham, who was a great territorial magnate. He owned basically half of Yorkshire. Menzies, as you all know, spent most of his career in government, but he was shaped by the wilderness years of the 1940s. Burke was the opposite. Although he spent most of his career in opposition, the formative period for his politics was the first Rockingham administration of 1765-66. Menzies took the lesson that the primary task was to get into government and stay there. But he also thought about what he was going to do in government. Burke's primary goal was revenge on those who, he thought, had sabotaged his time in government. Politics for him was personal in a way that it wasn't for Menzies. That's the background to one of Burke's most famous works, the Thoughts on the Cause of the Present Discontents, published in 1770. Although it's often quoted as a defence of party in general, it's really written to justify the behaviour of a particular party, the Rockingham Whigs. It's a step towards our modern idea of a party system, where different parties alternate in power and accept one another's legitimacy, but that wasn't really Burke's intention. Menzies also played a major role in shaping his country's party system. Although he greatly admired Burke, their approaches to politics were quite different. There's a pragmatic attitude in Menzies that's generally absent in Burke. The metaphor of cricket is irresistible. Menzies saw politics as a game. Not that he didn't take it seriously. He took cricket very seriously too. But it's a structured pursuit with rules, with an ethos of playing by the rules and acting fairly. And that was a great help to Menzies when he was founding the Liberal Party, trying to get people with a range of backgrounds and perspectives to work together. There's some of that attitude in Burke, in his most Whiggish moments, but most of the time Burke is quite different. His politics is a life and death struggle. He's on the edge of the abyss. Hell is opening up. There's an apocalyptic sort of tone to Burke that's quite alien to Menzies. The Whigs didn't have a Menzies. They had no one who combined parliamentary and organisational talent with a mainstream ideological and policy position. That was their great failing. So whereas Menzies has a continuing legacy after his death, and there's a political party that can clearly claim him as its own, I mean, there might not be for much longer, but Burke doesn't. The Rockingham Whigs split in the constitutional crisis of 1783-84, and then again over the French Revolution in the 1790s. So by the 19th century, Burke's legacy was already fractured and disputed between liberals and conservatives. On to social philosophy. Obviously enough, there's a huge difference in circumstances between the two. Australia lacked many of the institutions that were fundamental to Burke's outlook, especially the hereditary aristocracy. Aristocracy was tremendously important to Burke. Consistent theme in his career, perhaps influenced by the fact that it was a hereditary magnate who gave him his big break. An aristocracy is especially useful if you want to alternately defend liberal and conservative conclusions, as Burke did. On one hand, it can be the mainstay of constitutionalism, leading a resistance to monarchy. Montesquieu, for example, stresses this role before Burke's time. But then you can flip the image over, like Wittgenstein's Duck Rabbit, and the aristocracy is the essential conservative partner to monarchy, the bulwark of resistance to democracy and anarchy. Menzies had to do without any of that. Australia was democratic and egalitarian to an extent beyond anything that Burke could imagine, had been since before Menzies was born. So although he was conservative in many ways, a truly Burkean conservatism was impossible for him. Instead, Menzies' world had an institution that Burke had no experience of in the form of organised working class politics and the ALP, its political arm. And they were a perfect foil for Menzies. He could combat class politics while defending the interests of the middle class. And Menzies was a man of his class. I mean, class worked for him and it worked for his political party. He was comfortable in his own skin in that sense. Burke wasn't. Burke was a bourgeois adventurer in an aristocratic party. So there's a creative tension, you might call it, in Burke between bourgeois and aristocratic impulses. Ideologically, he defended the aristocracy more, for example, than Charles Fox, who was his friend and rival in the Whig Party. But Fox was the grandson of a duke, so he fitted in that world in a way that Burke never could. Now, if you can convince yourself that Burke didn't fundamentally change, and that his career exhibits a single consistent worldview, many people can't, and I have to say I can't really myself, then that Burkean sort of synthesis is a very useful thing for the non-Labour forces in Menzies' day. Burke shows that you can be liberal, reformist, rather than reactionary, but still basically supportive of the existing social order. It's got something for everyone. Reactionaries can convince themselves that they are really liberals at heart, and reformers can convince themselves that they're keeping the door firmly shut against revolution. But if you're not convinced of Burke's consistency over time, then you're going to start asking some uncomfortable questions about the coherence of the package. And it's no criticism of Menzies to say that he was not a philosopher and had no desire to ask uncomfortable questions. Menzies too had both the liberal and conservative impulses, but to his credit, he really did achieve a synthesis. He combined the two to his own satisfaction. If you look at his career, he sometimes leans one way and sometimes the other, but he never gives the impression that the two are at war within his own mind, but Burke does. A bit about economics. When it comes to economics, Burke endorsed what at the time was the very new sort of bourgeois doctrines of support for free markets associated with Adam Smith. Smith himself said, "Burke is the only man I ever knew who thinks on economic subjects exactly as I do without any previous communication." Hence Burke's long campaign for economical reform, which would limit royal influence over government. Direct contrast to how he later approached the French monarchy. How do you reconcile that with a defence of aristocracy? Burke did so by stressing the importance of property rights, which is rather different to Smith, who tended to see the aristocracy as parasites. And of course, also in contrast to the reality of 18th century landowning, in which the vast landed estates were basically the product of aristocratic robbery over the centuries. If you're a Marxist, which I'm not, by the way, this isn't a contradiction at all. All private fortunes are the product of exploitation, whether aristocratic or capitalist. From that point of view, Burke is a sort of prophet of hierarchical capitalism. He's the one who shows, as Crawford Macpherson put it, that the market economy cannot work unless a traditional class subordination is carried over into it. But if you're not a Marxist, you will see a tension there, and it's an objection to the Marxist view that Burke does indeed exhibit tension. Menzies, as I just said, had no aristocracy, But he had the same problem of trying to synthesise support for the market system with defence of the property of the privileged, especially in the protected industries that Australia was saddled with in his day. He managed by compromise. He was less of a Smithian than Burke, but he allowed enough of a role for markets to keep the economy ticking over. There's also what you might call a Hayekian streak in Burke, or perhaps more accurately, a Burkean streak in Hayek, with his stress on laws as embodying the accumulated wisdom of experience and therefore resistant to deliberate social engineering. But as is common with Burke, he gets a good idea, but he then takes it to extremes, using it as an argument against even modest piecemeal reform. Finally, personality. The first-hand accounts of Burke always come back to his difficult personality. No doubt Menzies had some trouble with interpersonal relationships as well. I mean, we all do at times, but nothing like this. Macaulay said, Burke's imagination and his passions, once excited, hurried him beyond the bounds of justice and good sense. The novelist Fanny Burney sat next to him at a dinner in 1792, recorded that when he talked politics, he had the expression of a man who is going to defend himself from murderers. And that wasn't just from his late period when he was obsessed with the French Revolution. Connor Cruise O'Brien, one of his biographers, unearthed a lovely example. When Burke was at university, Trinity College, he and some other students formed a debating society, as you do. And one of them proposed a rule that would forbid making personal reflections on other members. And Burke opposed that idea, saying, it's almost impossible to condemn bad actions without also condemning him from whom they proceed. And I suggest that's a very un-Menzian attitude. Menzies believed that you could still respect people that you disagreed with. His friendship with Ben Chifley is particularly famous in that regard. It was also the opposite of Fox's attitude to politics. Fox burst into tears in the House of Commons when Burke repudiated their friendship due to political differences. Burke was Irish, and that's always important in Britain. He never lost his Irish accent. He was always seen as an outsider, never fully trusted by his colleagues. Menzies too was an outsider. That's obvious when you see him visiting England. Not only is he a colonial, but in British terms, he's Scottish rather than English. But even in Australia, he's from some place in the bush that no one's ever heard of, trying to succeed among the establishment in a very status-conscious world. Isaac Kramnik, who was one of Burke's biographers, constructed a whole psychological theory about Burke's insecurities. He's got this Freudian interpretation about the conflict between the feminine aristocratic principle and the masculine bourgeois principle. As it happens, Judith Brett, in her Robert Menzies' Forgotten People, gives a very similar interpretation of Menzies, without the sexual underpinnings, but including the rivalry with his father and the constant yet equivocal struggle for acceptance. I don't buy the Freudian interpretation in either case, but I don't think it's far-fetched to see both men as divided personalities. The difference comes in how effectively they deal with that. Menzies had insecurities, but he dealt with them. He learnt to present an integrated self. As a result, he was relatively predictable. You read about Menzies, you never have the sense of, oh my God, he's such a volcanic personality. What's he going to do next? But with Burke, you do. His colleagues were always apprehensive about what he was going to do next, what new enthusiasm he was going to come up with. Both men had a problem with intellectual arrogance. Each of them was convinced, with some justice, that he was the smartest man in the room. But that's not an advantage in politics. Being seen too clever by half is a distinct handicap, as Gough Whitlam and Malcolm Turnbull, for example, later discovered. But Menzies learnt, painfully, to temper that arrogance. He learnt to take advice. Probably not as much as he should have, but he did learn, whereas Burke never did. I'll finish with a question that I think that what I've said might have raised. Given the differences between Burke and Menzies, why did Menzies admire Burke so much? What's the tie there? And I think the key to it is that it's not about Burke as he really was, but it's about the myth of Burke that was constructed by later generations. The early 20th century which of course is when Menzies is growing up and Menzies is learning about this stuff, was the heyday of the Whig interpretation of Burke. Burke as the liberal theorist of party who contested the George III's attempts to establish absolute monarchy and defended the rights of America and India, but was also realistic enough to perceive and warn against the dangers of the French Revolution. That was the Burke that Menzies grew up with. Menzies was already launched on his political career when the Whig interpretation came under sustained attack from Louis Namier and his school, who dismantled a lot of the mythology around Burke's politics. My personal view is that the Namierites went a bit too far in that direction, but it was a valuable corrective. George III was not aiming to be an absolute monarch. He was trying to make the Constitution work, which was a difficult enough task. The interpretation of Burke as a conservative idol comes later still. It comes in the post-war period, the 1950s, particularly with Russell Kirk in America. But it's the Whig Burke that Menzies admires when, on his first visit to England, which we heard about this morning, he visits the famous sites of British constitutional history and gives them a thoroughly Whig interpretation. He talks about, I don't have the quote in front of me, but he talks about Oliver Cromwell as the man who saved the British Constitution. So he sees Burke as a Whig, and he admires that Burke even though it's largely a fiction, as of course is Kirk's version as well, and as to some extent are all historical interpretations, including perhaps the one I've just offered you. But thank you for listening to it.
It is quite clear that Robert Menzies had enormous respect for Stanley Baldwin. The purpose of this paper is both to explain that respect and examine its consequences. Doing so, I'll show an emerging Menzian tradition in Australia, springing from direct dialogue with the revised Toryism which emerged in the 1920s and 30s, thus correcting an unduly parochial view of the origins of the Menzies tradition in Australia. I will do this by establishing their shared foundation in nonconformist religious dissent and philosophical idealism, which both emphasised the individual's responsibility to the wider community. I will then identify the strategic political convergence, the shared task of consolidating middle-class support by appealing to a public persona that represented a solid, constructive progress, mixing liberal and conservative sentiments. Finally, I'll examine Baldwin's mastery of public rhetoric, particularly broadcast radio, as the templates Menzies needed to translate that project into an Australian context. So the first one, the moral cultural bedrock, dissent, character and institution. Menzies' liberalism and Baldwin's conservatism were shaped by a shared, deep-seated Protestant heritage, producing an ethos that combined fierce individualism with reverence for institutional tradition. Menzies' personal politics were marked by the pervasive nonconformist culture in which he was raised. His father, James Menzies, was a deeply committed lay preacher. This Puritan cultural ethic, as Gregory Melhuish and Stephen Chavura had described it, was central to Menzies' ideals, emphasising the robust independence of conscience and character essential to freedom. Stemming from Protestantism's revolt against established authority, this tradition emphasised the essential egalitarianism of the spirit and a firm repudiation of caste and hierarchy. It was also a key element in 19th century British liberalism, underpinning the intensely evangelical tonality of Gladstonian high liberalism. James Menzies, who named one of his sons after Gladstone, was saturated in this style of liberalism. Yet Robert Menzies also possessed what he termed an instinctive conservatism. His 1935 declaration to the Westminster Parliament was his most concise articulation of this stance. The greatest aim in public affairs is to preserve everything we have that is good. His dominant tone is reverence, not revolt, philosophical liberalism combined, as Paul Hasluck noted, with institutional conservatism. Baldwin's intellectual and moral foundations, although laid in earlier decades, mirrored this synthesis. While his father had converted to Anglicanism, Baldwin's extended family on both sides was staunchly Wesley Methodist. His time at Cambridge was profoundly influenced by a Christianity-infused philosophical idealism that sought to be a, quote, truly national alternative to both liberalism and socialism. Crucially, both Baldwin and Menzies rejected the inflammatory political style of the previous generation and of their immediate political opponents. Menzies rejected the revivalist emotionalism of his father's public speaking. Baldwin, despite his own dissenting roots, mastered a brilliantly understated, musingly ruminative rhetoric, the complete counter to the evangelist. This quiet command of the public conversational register, merging high-minded idealism with pragmatic institutional conservatism, set profound foundations for their mutual recognition. 2. Converging political trajectories. Complementing those shared foundations, the political evolution of both Britain and Australia from the late 19th century established a crucial structural convergence, forcing non-Labor parties in both nations into a common position as the sole national anti-socialist alternative. In Britain, the Conservative Party was compelled to adapt to mass suffrage politics from the 1880s, successfully managing the shift from a landed elite party to a popular political party, appealing across class lines. The rise of Tory democracy, which built on Disraeli's One Nation in sight. Meanwhile, the dynamic in Australia saw liberalism shift from being an all-pervasive political culture in the 19th century into a distinct partisan side. The emergence of the Labor Party from the 1890s forced Australian Liberals to focus on conserving the institutions, practices and ethos of a liberal society. This defensive posture brought Keith Hancock, Menzies' Melbourne University contemporary, to assert in 1930 that in Australia, if a politician declares that he is liberal, his audience will understand that he is by nature conservative. The final catalyst was the post-World War I collapse of the Liberal parties in British politics. With the English Liberals disappearing as a serious contender, the Tories became the de facto sole non-Labor party, requiring them to appeal to former Liberal voters. The years of Baldwin's ascendancy solidified this shift to a more explicitly middle-class Toryism. The parallel post-war response in Australia was to prefer the encompassing and unifying term national or nationalist over liberal. From 1917 to 1931, the Nationalist Party, which dominated Australian government, was formed by a wartime fusion of Liberals and Labor renegades, committed wholly to the national and imperial cause. Governments, said Prime Minister Stanley Bruce, expressing the party's underlying ethos, should reflect national rather than partisan interests. This points to the deeper cause of the evaporation of the Liberal name in post-World War I Australia. Australian liberalism found it difficult to adjust to a new environment where Liberals were one, not both, sides of politics, forming the legions of Hancock's parties of resistance. In Victoria, John Latham, Frederick Eggleston and others established the Liberal Union to try and bring explicit liberalism back onto the political stage for the 1922 election. Whilst Billy Hughes dismissed them as troglodytes in their caves, Stanley Bruce, then Treasurer, called them conservative reactionaries. Clearly, the public meaning of the term liberal had come to be dominated by the conservative defensive posture. Menzies' own role later in the 1920s is ambiguous. He was a leading part of the rising generation of post-war Victorian right-of-centre politicians who looked to re-engage the polity with fundamentally liberal values and ideals, but did so within the nationalist political party. He formed a young nationalist pressure group to influence the major non-Labor party from within rather than without. The overall trend in these decades, however, is clear, yet paradoxical. English Tories had incorporated Liberals and liberalism. Australian Liberals, meanwhile, had taken on the role usually ascribed to conservatism, and the word liberal had passed from the partisan scene. By the time Menzies met Baldwin in 1935, the bases for structural and ideological convergence had been laid. 3. The anti-socialist platform, idealism and the property-owning ethos. The third and most deeply philosophical element of the convergence was the development of a common political agenda, which countered class-based socialism by grounding its aspirational platform in British idealism and a robust Protestant Christianity. For both leaders, the argument against socialism was a moral and spiritual defence of the autonomous individual. The philosophical idealism that dominated in the late 19th and early 20th century taught a social Christianity and an organic conception of society, quote, which demanded active citizenship, providing a powerful intellectual bulwark against both utilitarian atomism and state socialism. Baldwin was directly exposed to this tradition at Cambridge. His chaplain, William Cunningham, impressed upon him an, quote, economic, moral and Christian conservatism as the positive and truly national alternative to both liberalism and socialism. Baldwin subsequently translated this idealist training into political rhetoric saturated with calls to strive for moral and spiritual ideals, social responsibility and sacrifice. His anti-socialist critique in 1937, marked by Menzies in his own personal copy, placed, quote, the infinite value of the human soul at the core of the democratic state. Quote, the Christian state proclaims human personality to be supreme. The servile state denies this. Every compromise with the infinite value of the human soul leads straight back to the savagery of the jungle. A parallel, distinctively Australian idealist current profoundly shaped Robert Menzies during his time at Melbourne University. Menzies himself articulated central themes from the idealist civic gospel in editorials for the Melbourne University magazine, poems, and other short pieces. In a 1914 poem, Menzies describes moving forward in the spirit of pure idealism. Into the future, with distant hopes gleaming, glimpses of dreamland shall show us the way. There is behind us a spirit that prompts us. There is what tells that dawn is ahead. Dreaming the dream of a world that is better, seeing the vision of men that are free. It is not childish to have ideals, he editorialised 2 years later. They are the motive force of all purposeful action. There have been too many eras when the great idealists have found themselves rigidly shut out from the practical strivings of their fellow men. It was imperative too to, quote, have the high ideals of what we can do for the state. However, a key difference was Australian idealism's passionate commitment to the British Empire as an idealist project. While British idealism focused more on the state to animate national community, in Australia, the overarching commitment was to empire, described by Eggleston in 1916 as the main factor in the world's progress towards democratic ideals. This was a formulation which reconciled empire and liberty and was widely taught in pre-war civics textbooks by civic liberal Walter Murdoch, who had also been deeply influenced by the idealist creed. While the empire commitment didn't feature largely in British idealist formulations, it did permeate Baldwin's political ethos and British conservative thought more broadly. Like Australian liberal idealists, Baldwin considered the empire a common project, one home and one people, whose citizens were those to whom freedom and justice are as the breath of their nostrils. This shared philosophical backdrop provided the moral leverage for both leaders to launch their anti-socialist platforms. Baldwin's use of the seminal concept of a property-owning democracy was projected morally as the method to raise people up into a society where the individual may become an owner. For Menzies, this same vision reaches full expression in his Forgotten People broadcast in 1942. His description of the home's spiritual was underpinned by the idealist belief that the greatest element in a strong people is a fierce independence of spirit. Democracy, too, he famously argued, was not a system, but a spirit, a living faith, quote, rooted in the Christian conception that there is in every human soul a spark of the divine, directly echoing the passage from Baldwin's book, which he had marked a few years earlier. The blend of philosophical idealism, Protestant nonconformist ethics, and individual striving gave both Menzies and Baldwin a powerful shared moral narrative which could successfully counter the materialist, class-driven narratives of their socialist opponents. 4. Rhetoric and the remaking of popular appeal. The final essential component of the convergence was the pioneering of a new political style that could project that blend while meeting the challenges of mass democracy and mass media. At its heart was broadcast radio. Baldwin came to political leadership during the early years, not just of mass democracy, but, quote, of the modern mass media. He was the first politician to truly master radio broadcasting. The radio audience was dispersed and fragmented, often in family homes, and not necessarily politically committed. Baldwin's success lay in developing, from his very first conservative political broadcast in October 1924, an intimate, conversational, and seductively non-party tone. His broadcasts reinforced his public demeanour, strengthening impressions of calmness, sympathy, straightforwardness, and likeability. Until Churchill's 1940 broadcasts, Baldwin was universally acknowledged to be, quote, the most experienced, most respected, and most popular politician on radio. Indeed, the supreme wireless personality. This enabled him to further expand his role as a self-styled teacher and public moralist, even a lay preacher, appealing to a doctrine that had wide foundations in British public life and resonated with people of all parties and none. This style was exactly what was needed in Australia. The immense popularity of United Australia Party Prime Minister Joseph Lyons was rooted in his projection of affable ordinariness, described by one observer as the Australian counterpart of Baldwin. In the chronically shocked post-war decades, Lyons exemplified the appeal of solid, trustworthy probity. Menzies' young nationalists backed him precisely because he exemplified, quote, sanity, decency, common values, honesty above party divisions. When Menzies met Baldwin in 1935, he was still widely perceived as too removed to connect with ordinary Australians. As Eggleston put it, Menzies suffered from, quote, the innate repulsion of the people against the too clever intellectual. This context explains Menzies' extremely high valuation of Baldwin as, quote, unquestionably the greatest Englishman I met, which is in 1935, so he may have revised that when he got to Churchill in the Second World War. Menzies immediately recognised Baldwin's successful political entrepreneurship, fusing character with principles and mastering, again, to quote Menzies, a capacity for making a popular appeal which raises people above themselves. Menzies' own development of public rhetoric and his capacity to connect with ordinary Australians expanded prodigiously from then on. Tony Eggleton summed up Menzies' ascendancy as springing from the fact that he had an unparalleled, quote, skill for reading the community. He had this strong feeling about the man in the street, the ordinary people, and governing for the majority of the people. And a command of radio was a critical element in projecting that skill. In short, the political projects of Robert Menzies and Stanley Baldwin were not isolated national responses. Instead, they reflected a profound interwar convergence driven by shared structural imperatives and a common intellectual, religious, and cultural heritage. Their forging of a liberal conservative international, a transnational body of ideas and political solutions, provided the foundation for the liberal conservative ascendancy in both Australia and Britain after the Second World War. It underscores that the liberalism Menzies successfully championed from 1944 was a nuanced political synthesis containing a substantial admixture of conservatism. The mutual recognition between Menzies and Baldwin in 1935 was a critical symbolic moment that confirms the creation of a new, durable political model designed to manage mass democracy and counter socialism. An asserted shared Britishness on the political right was therefore far more than sentimental attachment. It was a dynamically active community engaged in international learning and the practical transfer of solutions to problems in a fractious, increasingly unpredictable world. The challenge is to understand and master those dynamics of shared learning and understanding in the no less troubling circumstances of today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's wonderful to be here today. I haven't come quite as far as Martin, but Queensland certainly feels far enough away if you're a Queenslander. So I suppose I'm going to talk a little bit, talk about Menzies, but also go a little bit broader and talk about the role and place of Australia in the wider British conservative imagination, in which Menzies plays an important role, but not a singular one. And I suppose one of the things that really got me thinking and interested in this subject is the fact that the last couple of years in the UK have seen an absolutely remarkable Australianisation of British conservative politics. And 4 out of the last 7 general election campaigns for the Tories have been directed by Australians. Actually, most of them by Queenslanders. I'm tempted to kind of do a Queenslandification of British conservative politics, but that's maybe getting too parochial. Another element is the way in which an awful lot of Australian public policy was embraced by conservatives over the last 2 decades, from things like higher education to policies around Chinese investment. Often there's very direct and obvious policy copying. Most importantly, though, and I think you can see this from the picture of Rishi Sunak up there, is the way that Australia has suffused conservative political language from either slogans like "Stop the Boats" and this kind of direct copying, or more interestingly, to appending just the words Australian style to certain policies. So, for example, Michael Howard back in 2005 and subsequent Conservatives afterwards always talked about introducing an Australian style points immigration system. Likewise, Boris Johnson talked very much about an Australian-style trade agreement with the European Union. There's a kind of sense almost that, particularly kind of for post-Brexit Britain, Australia can act as a kind of a model of what a kind of independent, well, outside of the European Union, Britain could be like. There's a sort of kind of earthy common sense to it that's kind of projected in conservative imaginations. And I could talk a lot about this, kind of the reasons why we've had this Australianisation, and I'd be delighted to answer questions on that. But in this paper, I want to take a slightly longer view and think about how British conservatives have imagined and written about Australia since the Second World War. Now, I'm aware what I'm going to give is a very partial perspective. There's some kind of key moments missing. Martin gave a wonderful discussion about the role of Australia in the European Union and EC debates. I'm so glad you did that, so I didn't have to. Nonetheless, I think it will hopefully kind of give you a sense of some forgotten moments in the politics of both countries. So my story is basically broken into three parts. First, the Menzies era, when Australia is seen broadly as a kind of non-problem country. The 1980s, when kind of Thatcherite triumphalism takes over. And finally, the 1990s, when discussions of Australia very much get brought into a wider discussion about modernisation in British politics. And in this story, journalists play an awfully big role, because more than Tory politicians or Tory intellectuals, it was journalists who spent their time talking and writing about Australia, as I discovered, often on Ashes tours, where you had to provide some kind of copy outside of the test days and the fact that England would often be shellacked in a couple of them, so you've got a bit more writing to do. But to begin with, we need to remember how I think before and immediately after World War II, Australia was actually seen as a model for British conservatives to avoid. And alongside Australia's experiment with nationalisation, it was the power of trade unions which were of the greatest concern. And here, post-war Tories shared Anthony Eden's view of Queensland back in 1926, when he lamented that not only did the state control the railways, but the railwaymen controlled the state. Now, obviously, as someone who works for the Queensland Department of Transportation, I could not possibly comment on that. Tellingly, though, in the post-war period, it's often the social dimension of trade union power in Australia that concerns British conservatives the most. Geoffrey Rawson, writing in the Spectator in early 1949, mocked Australian so-called egalitarianism by reminding his readers that in Australia, quote, Labour is firmly in the saddle, such that the onus is on the passenger to close the door in the railway and deliver up his tickets. The tram conductor browbeats his fare, and this was the worst of all, the waiter puts his feet up on the sofa. Now, in 1949, Menzies' election begins to start to change some of these views. And the fact that his election comes 3 days before the election in New Zealand of Sir Sidney Holland certainly gives a sense of real genuine excitement amongst British conservatives who've been kind of labouring after the great defeat in 1945 and what's seen as the forward march of Labour. There's a sense that actually maybe the tide might be turning, and that just as out in the colonies there was a turn to Labour during the Second World War that happened earlier than in Britain, so the turn away from it might be happening in the colonies in advance of what will happen later in the metropole. And indeed, by 1954, one can definitely pick up a sense of jealousy on the part of British conservatives when it came to Menzies' success in reducing union power and reversing post-war collectivism. Certainly in contrast to what were often critiqued as the somewhat more ameliorative and to some pinko policies of the Churchill-Eden governments at the time. And there's this sense that people, and especially middle-class people, can get on in Australia in the 1950s in a way that they couldn't back home. And this is something that's very acute in the novels of Neville Shute. Aeronautical engineer turned novelist, Shute emigrated to Australia in 1950, having felt, quote, oppressed by British taxation. And his novel, A Town Like Alice, which is published in 1950, tells the story of a young English ex-POW, Jean Paget, who travels to Queensland to find the Aussie sergeant who saved her in the jungles of Malaya. In the novel, she inherits a fortune and she sets up a range of outback businesses. I think there's an ice cream parlour and there's also a crocodile leather processing plant. But what's important in the story is that she sets these businesses up not just for profit, but also for community benefit. One of the reasons why she gets so many people to come and work in the crocodile factory is because she installs air conditioning. So there's a wider benefit to the private enterprise in which she's engaged. And indeed, the whole book is a story about the transformative power of private enterprise and the ability to transcend class, gender, and cultural barriers, but only when very much correct sexual and racial behavior is followed. And as such, I think A Town Like Alice very much speaks to that kind of optimistic, modernizing, sometimes utopian, and also often frequently feminine conservatism that was prevalent in the UK before World War II and very much associated with some of the, what some historians have called the conservative modernism of people like Stanley Baldwin. Now, while in post-war Britain, that kind of conservative world was impossible to be realised, for Shute, and as for other conservatives, Australia was the one where it could be built. And the novel's ending, which includes the discovery that Jean's inheritance has come from the Australian gold rush, and it originally, speaks to this idea that the raw material of empire, though squandered in Britain, could, through the kind of middle-class virtues on display, be made to turn a social return down under. Indeed, as I've said, more broadly, Australia in this kind of Menzies era and its immediate aftermath was thought of as a largely non-problem country. And that's a quote. Now, of course, part of this very much was to do with the booming economy in Australia compared to what was seen at the time as relative British decline. It also owed a lot to Menzies' electoral success, as well as what was seen as the country's continued attachment to empire and monarchy. Arguably, though, Australia's uncomplicated status was understood also as a product of its racial and ethnic homogeneity. Already in the early 1950s, British emigrants to Rhodesia had commented upon their desire to escape a country that they thought was being overrun by West Indians. And looking through some of the testimony of kind of 10-pound poms, you certainly get a sense that a similar motive was behind at least some of the people that moved out to Australia in the era. You find quotes saying, this is a country that's been, at least this country is being kept for the white man. And discussions of the White Australia policy in British conservative circles at the time did tend to follow these lines, describing the policy as something by which Britishness had been preserved and racial problems prevented. And this was certainly the case in the writings of this man, Enoch Powell, who between 1937 and 1939 had been Professor of Greek at the University of Sydney. He spent an awful lot of his time there complaining about the Americanization of Australia, and that's a theme that we'll possibly return to. Writing in the National and English Review in 1958, Powell described how arriving in Australia by air, quote, "White Australia meant things at once. Across the Timor Sea from the Dutch East Indies and all those other lands where the European was Curzon's speck of white foam upon a dark and thunderous ocean. Here at Darwin, in a fierce climate on a harsher soil, were a handful of Britons behaving just as though they were, in Australian as well as English parlance, at home." So for Powell, the White Australia policy was a protector of Britishness and the right to keep it that way. Powell goes on to talk about how important it was that in Australia, the white man had actually done the hard work of building a nation. And here, I think it's rather ironic that he chooses Darwin as the place to make this point, given the fact that it has a large and historic Chinese community. As another conservative commentator put it, quote, however shocking to the liberal-minded, the White Australia policy means that Aussies are the only tropical Europeans in the world who've done their own dirty manual labour. A country that had been built successfully by white hands could therefore safely reject the calls for non-white immigration on cultural, economic and political grounds. Now, I think to suggest, though, that the White Australia policy was the dominant theme in conservative accounts of Australia in the 1950s and 60s would be to very much overdo it. More than anything, in fact, it was the Australian optimism that really captured the Tory imagination. And this way of thinking arguably peaked in the 1970 general election. That year's party manifesto was called A Better Tomorrow, and it took its line from a line that Ted Heath, the leader of the Conservative Party at the time, had actually picked up from a cabbie in Sydney. In a TV broadcast, Heath contrasted this Australian expression of optimism with the situation in the UK and how, quote, nobody in this country would say that, not these days. And spliced with footage of Heath winning the Sydney to Hobart yacht race and dominated by an election campaign that spoke of freedom and opportunity and was unusually, at least from our perspective these days, very much a campaign aimed squarely at young people. There was a sense that this focus on Australia as a sunny, young, optimistic country really did cut through to pundits, media and the public alike. Indeed, there was some polling done on the broadcast that involved this discussion of Australia. And the ratings from that really were very positive and much more positive than any of the other party political broadcasts that the Conservatives put out at that election. Now, sort of turning a bit further on to the Thatcher era, this sense of Australia, the exemplar, and Britain, the basket case, kind of switches around. And again, trade unions are very much top of mind. Bill Deeds, the veteran Conservative MP turned Daily Telegraph editor, wrote in 1982 how, after reading some accounts in Australia of trade union goings-on, I have been led to conclude that I had grievously misjudged our own brothers. They seem, by contrast with some of Australia's, to be pure as the driven snow. And more broadly, the experience of arriving in Sydney in 1986 was for Ralph Harris, one of the founders of the Institute for Economic Affairs. For him, it said he felt like he'd been transported back in time to those seething pre-Thatcher years which led to the winter of our discontents. And despite some praise for the ALP's policy of opening up the Australian economy, the overall picture was of Hawke as a kind of mini Wilson, stuck in a corporatist mindset, which had long been abandoned in the UK. And what's interesting is that this disparagement of Australia's economy in the 1980s also extended to the Liberal Party, which at the time was deemed in the British conservative press as weak, ineffectual, and unideological compared to its British equivalent. Thatcher herself had personal experience of this difference in party cultures during the visit she made to Australia in 1976. Speaking to the Liberal Federal Council and influenced by a recent reading of Solzhenitsyn, she outlined her personal philosophy to find that, quote, the applause was far from deafening, and that conservative-minded audiences in Australia were not used to this form of unapologetic conservatism. And as Martin mentioned, it was also on this trip that Thatcher undertook her own personal pilgrimage to go and see the ageing Menzies. And 5 years later, at that 1981 Menzies Memorial Lecture, Thatcher spoke of Menzies' own deeply and firmly held inner convictions. And as Martin said, the encouragement that he had given her to talk about her philosophy of life and the principles that should govern public life. Now, for me, I kind of read this invocation of the importance of being a conviction politician not only as a reflection of the experience that she'd had with Menzies, but also a not so subtle dig at Malcolm Fraser, a man whom she considered far too tied to welfarism and protectionist economic policies to truly embrace the goal of creating a free market economy. It was a good thing that Margaret Thatcher was not nearly as good a student as Menzies, as the many people in this room who've pointed out actually his distance from many of the policies that she would later embrace. And even the elevation of John Howard in 1985 didn't really change Tory ideas of their sister party. As the Times put it in 1987, there was no analogy between Australia in the late 80s and Britain in the late 70s. For in Australia, there is no Mrs. Thatcher, just a bunch of quarrelling politicians whose parties have had the chance before and apparently failed to use it. Coming to the 1990s, we again go through another change, another dramatic change. And while still not considered an ideologue, and Howard becomes celebrated by British conservatives as a man who, unlike their own leaders, had managed to successfully combine kind of Thatcherite economic liberalism with a form of social conservatism and get elected. Now, of course, this turnaround in views again probably reflects changing electoral fortunes between the key countries. But I'd also argue that it is part to do with the context of modernisation and the debate around it that was going on in Britain at the time. Because for a while, modernisation was the key watchword of Tony Blair and New Labour, the ideological justification for everything from Scottish devolution to the banning of fox hunting. And Blair's most complete statement about it comes in this book. His 1997 New Britain, My Vision for a Young Country. And in it, Blair describes what he saw as a lack of confidence in Britain. To regain it, what he suggested was that Britain needed to reimagine itself as a young country to fit into this new, modern, globalized world which was emerging. As he said, "We are a country with a great past, but too often we seem to live in it rather than learn from it. Changing the mindset so that we are the masters of change rather than victims of it is what I mean when I talk about making Britain a young country. It is a country convinced that its best times can lie ahead, fired with ambition, but improved by idealism, compassion, and justice." Now, as Blair explained in 2006, speaking at Canberra, Australia was very much the model for this young country that he had in mind. And this shouldn't really come as a surprise, because Blair actually was in many ways an Aussie-phile. And he'd spent some time growing up in Adelaide, and some of his political and social awakenings had happened from Australians. You get conservatives, some of whom, like Matthew Parris, actually come quite close to embracing this vision, this notion that in Australia there was a way, as he talks about, of moving on from the past, acknowledging it while also getting this tense right, that it is the past. For other British conservatives, you get a rather different view, this rejection of Australia, partly because of the way it's been embraced by Labour. And this is a quote from Rod Liddell, a somewhat odious man, I don't mind if that's recorded, who wrote a rather disparaging thing about the way in which Australians at the time were seen as wishing themselves to be Asian, and why that was not in fact the case. Most often, though, what you got from British commentators at the time was an attempt to kind of reject the premise of this question, to actually say, look, the reason why Howard has been successful, and this is the argument of this chap here, Simon Heffer, who's a Tory historian and journalist and cricket fan, he was saying, look, Australia might be a young country and one that we should emulate, but it's not a progressive country. And actually, the things that have made Australia great and the things that have made kind of a modern multicultural Australia work are things that Blair himself would never like the fact of having a very strong immigration policy. So, to conclude, what themes can we extract from this brief historical tour? Well, I think the first one is that obviously this wave of Australianisation that we've seen in the British Conservative Party is new in form, but not necessarily, starting from scratch. They've not employed Australian strategists before, but the notion that Australia is an exemplar for Britain, a place where lost British values, practice and traditions can either live on or can still be expressed, has long existed. And Brexiteers' image of Australia as a kind of buccaneering free enterprise nation, in contrast to Britain shut away in the EEC, is just the latest manifestation. And I think that's arguably why some British commentators on Australia have been so upset, whether it's kind of Enoch Powell or someone like Rod Liddell, about this notion of Australia moving away from Britain. Because for as long as Australia maintains a country that kind of has British values and British traditions and British interests, there's a sense amongst British conservatives that that can be re-imported to the motherland. So Australia kind of acts in this way as a half laboratory and a half deep freeze. Nonetheless, I'd argue that there are still very consistent blind spots in the way in which British conservatives think about Australians. And one of them, and I think that's probably because I come from state politics, is that there's a focus on Australia as a country as a whole without recognising its important states and territories and the very different political cultures in them, as well as a failure to recognise that Australia actually has a very different set of political structures and constitutional structures. And thus, if Conservatives really want to learn from Australia, not just use it as a rhetorical device, they need to better understand its past.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.